First, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight in what will be, I know, a very special event. I am Ling Hang Ting Wing, and I'm the interim director of the the Weatherhead East Asia Institute, and hold the Dorothy Borg Chair in the History of the United States and East Asia. Before we begin, though, as a representative, as the interim director of Weatherhead, I want to take the time to thank our co-sponsors, and that includes the Department of History, the Society of Fellows and Humane Center for the Humanities, and the Center for American Studies. But I think one of the biggest shout-outs goes to an individual who really made this come together, and that's Athena Fontenot at the Institute, who basically did, I think, all of the heavy lifting. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Daniel Weiss, author of In That Time, Michael O'Donnell and the Tragic Era of Vietnam. Now, Dan is truly a Renaissance man. He was a professor of art history at Johns Hopkins, has published extensively on Byzantine art, served as college presidents of not one, but two colleges, Lafayette College and Haverford College. And now he can add to that impressive list, he's also a historian of the Vietnam War era. But perhaps the most impressive part was that while he was researching and writing this book, he was moonlighting as president and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, some of you might know that place. It's somewhere on Fifth Avenue. You might have ventured there, right across the park. But Dan, I do have to say something before we begin, that is, whenever you want to trade jobs and teach Vietnam War history to Columbia students, let me know, because I think you've inspired me to be a Renaissance woman. So I'm going to give running the Met a try. All right, we'll switch. In all seriousness, tonight you really are in for a special treat. I just wanted to share, when I finished the last page of In That Time, I was literally wiping away tears as they were streaming down my face. And, as someone who has studied the futility of that war, and understand how many American and Vietnamese lives were affected by this conflict, I found myself returning to the moving poetry of Michael O'Donnell. Now, while Dan will discuss his poetry, his life that was taken too soon, and his death that will never lose meaning, I just want to read to you one of Michael O'Donnell's poems that I think basically captures what Dan did in this book. If I were to open all of my world to you and talk of whom I loved best, even when we had to wander in our times, and even when miles and more months than a year were between us. Dan Weiss, what you did within that time spanned not only the distance and the time, but also brought back the words of the dead to those of us who are lucky enough to be alive. You'll see that tonight. Dan Weiss.
Well, I'd like to express my thanks. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to all of you for inviting me. It really is a privilege to be here and have a chance to talk about this project. I should say, though, from the outset, Hang, if you'd like to trade places, I would be fired before you would. I can guarantee you that. If you knew what I really did. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit at the beginning of our hour together about this project, about why I wrote this book, what I learned from the book, and then we'll open it up for questions and make sure we have a chance to talk about whatever aspects of this project or this issue are of interest to you. And so to do that is a little bit of a personal narrative. As an art historian and a scholar, this is the first book that I've written in this way, which is really engaging more of my own personal experience and the world around me. I'm a medievalist by training, so mostly I write about things that happened a millennium ago. And these events in this book happened in my lifetime, so it was also a very different kind of project. But in the first instance, I wrote this book because I came across one of Michael O'Donnell's poems, which was written in Harold Evans's magisterial book, An American Century. It's a book about the 20th century, mostly political history and social history. And in that book, there is a section on the Vietnam War. And within that section, there was a narrow column on the margins of one page that had the photograph of this very fine-looking, happy young man, and below it a poem. And the poem was very moving. So I read it, and I'm going to read it to you to start, to give you some sense of this journey that I embarked on. And this is what he wrote. If you are able, save for them a place inside of you, and save one backward glance when you are leaving for the places they can no longer go. Be not ashamed to say you love them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they have left and what they have taught you with their dying, and keep it with your own. And in that time, when men decide and feel safe to call the war insane, take one moment to embrace those gentle heroes you left behind. I read in Evans's book that this poem was written by Michael O'Donnell on January 1st of 1970, while he was serving in Vietnam in the northern highlands central highlands of Vietnam as a helicopter pilot. And he was a poet, and this was one of many poems he had written during that time. I was very curious as to who this person was. I should add, at the bottom of that, Evans said also that 3 months after this poem was written, Michael O'Donnell's helicopter was shot down, and as of his writing, he remains missing in action. This was nearly 30 years after the fact. So I was just very curious as to know who this person was and what motivated him to write the kind of poem that I just read, and what were the circumstances around him as a scholar and someone who is avidly interested in history, although I have to say I wasn't especially interested in the Vietnam War, having grown up in its shadow. I had kind of had enough of that as a teenager. But I was very interested in who this person was. So I began to just try to learn more about him. And I discovered very quickly that Michael had been a very talented and engaging young songwriter and musician, and that he performed with friends in the early 1960s in folk music clubs, and he had made an album. He was quite good. And that his very best friend was Marcus Sullivan. They were college roommates and musical partners. They performed together. And I discovered that this poem I had read was written in a letter to Marcus, who was back in the States. He had also served in Vietnam, but he was already home from the war. And Michael sent that in a letter to Marcus. So I thought in my odyssey to learn more about this person and what it is that his story is to tell, I reached out and found Marcus Sullivan, who was a retired school teacher in Wisconsin. So I went to Wisconsin, and I met with him, and I found him to be a remarkable man who had an extraordinary story to tell as well. And he shared a great deal about Michael, and it became clear to me very quickly there's a very powerful human interest story here embedded in the context of this tragic era in Vietnam, and that I would want to learn more and see what we could do. We shortly then located Michael's sister, who was basically the only relative Michael O'Donnell had left. Both of his parents had died years before. And Patsy was living in Las Vegas. So Marcus and I went off to meet with her in Las Vegas. I still didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I wanted to learn more, and there was a story here in some fashion. So when meeting with Patsy, and she, of course, knew Marcus, they were all friends from years before, it became clear to me right away there was a very powerful story based on the materials that Patsy had and what she was able to share about her brother. And also, she was extraordinarily relieved that someone from out in the ether had shown up at her doorstep interested in carrying on, learning more about the legacy of her brother. By this time, his poetry was very well known. The poem I read, for example, is inscribed in war memorials all over the United States, including the New York City Vietnam Veterans Memorial, if you've ever visited that downtown. In the inscription in the glass at the top is Michael O'Donnell's poetry. So she had been carrying on the legacy of her brother and being a steward of his history and his poetry. And so she was very eager to actually give me materials. And she took out of a storage area a great big box filled with materials that were quite remarkable. Inside the box, there was almost everything associated with Michael's life. His birth certificate, photographs of his childhood, all military records, his medals, including, and perhaps most powerfully, a pile of letters, 1.5 inch thick stack of letters from the U.S. Army that were related to Michael's status as a missing in action soldier. And I will tell you more about that a little bit later in my remarks. But there was an extraordinarily powerful documentary record of this young man's life, and both before the war and what happened to him during the war. And that, along with his poetry and the testimony of his friends and family who I was able to track down, it became clear to me I'd like to write a book about him. And in so doing, to explore a couple of questions that I thought were important to me. The first was, this is a human interest story I want to learn more about. His own life was something of interest that I thought, one of 58,220 American soldiers who were killed, not to mention the many millions of others from that war in Vietnam, the Vietnamese, and others. One powerful story can actually do a great deal to help people understand and remember. So I wanted to do that. But at the same time, I was especially interested in trying to understand more about the war. I graduated from high school just before the draft, and so I was, I should say I was in high school before the draft ended. After the draft ended, sorry. I was not eligible for the draft is what I'm trying to get across here. And therefore, I wasn't worried myself about serving, but people in my community served. And I grew up, like many of us probably did, who lived through that era. Every single day on the news, there were stories about what was happening in Vietnam, the ubiquitous helicopters and casualty rates and battles in various cities that I couldn't pronounce. So I grew up with that as a shadow in my life and found it to be, on the one hand, clearly, even as a young person, it was clear that our government had somehow failed terribly in this action, but I didn't know that much about it. I wanted to then, in writing this book, I wanted to dig into this material and read and try to get a better sense of what actually happened. And as someone who has spent the last 20 years of my life in much more modest positions of leadership, but in the capacity of a decision maker, how are these people making decisions? What were they actually thinking and doing as they were executing decisions that led to the loss of lives of others? I wanted to learn more about that. What was Lyndon Johnson really doing? What was Richard Nixon doing? And so forth. So as I dug into that material, I was hoping to understand for my own sake something about what happened in Vietnam, and if I could draw some conclusions. And in so doing, I was, as I say, interested in the dynamics of leadership. And then finally, I wanted, after doing that, thinking and reading, it became clear to me that the book I wanted to write was one that connected the lives of one innocent kid who was historically not important to the lives of those people who made decisions that resulted in his life ending. That is to say, what relationship did Lyndon Johnson have to Michael O'Donnell? How did the policies that were being enacted at the time affect people on the ground who were living through them? And what repercussions were there for those people in their circle? When someone dies tragically in an untimely way, it is always something very difficult to get over. We all know this. But to die in this way, in a war that came later to be identified as, in almost every possible way, a failure, is almost impossible to recover from. And I wanted to learn more about that. What did it mean for Michael's family and friends? We are at the 50-year anniversary of Michael's death right now. So there's a lot of history, a lot of time and space since that moment, but nonetheless, there was something to learn. So that was the ambition in writing this book, and for my own learning, and to try to tell this story. So I'd like to say a little bit about who Michael O'Donnell was. And let's start with Michael and his sister as little children. Michael was in many ways the quintessential post-war baby. He was born in 1945, and he grew up in an upper-middle-class family in Shorewood, Wisconsin, wanting for nothing in a lovely neighborhood where he had everything before him, including great prospects for the future. In high school, he discovered music and became very interested in music. Here he is as a middle school lad with his ubiquitous smile. And then in high school, he began to play music. He was never a distinguished student, I should say, and that's part of the text of the first part of his life. He was very bright, charismatic, engaging, interesting, an avid reader, and a lousy student. And he didn't do very well in high school, and he went off to college at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where in the fall of 1963, where he shortly thereafter met Marcus Sullivan, who you see in this picture. Michael is on the right, and Marcus is on the left. And they became very fast friends. They were both musicians. They both wanted to be, they kind of had Simon and Garfunkel in mind as a role model. Although this was before they had heard of Simon and Garfunkel, there were a lot of people like that on that track at that time. They started writing music together, and they harmonized beautifully, and they became lifelong friends. It was clear right from the outset for both of them that this was a very special relationship. And during that time together, so that's what they looked like when they were posing for an album cover kind of thing. They didn't really look like that. They really looked like that, like most college kids in the 1960s. But unlike most college kids who discovered music, they were avidly interested in writing their own music and exploring their own way. And around the time that this picture was taken when they were students, they made a folk album, and they imagined themselves to have a career ahead that would be full of promise. And Michael became increasingly interested in writing music, and the lyrics and the music. And then the shadow of Vietnam began to become increasingly large. By the time when Michael first arrived at college in 1963, there were a small number of troops stationed in Vietnam, and for the most part, this was not a topic that was of wide knowledge or understanding by the American people. All of that was to change in the next year or two. So by 1965, Michael had finished his sophomore year in college, and it became clear to him he wasn't going to stay at Whitewater. He wasn't thinking of himself as a student at quite the level he needed to be. So he went home to live with his parents and go to community college and try to figure out what was next. In the meantime, the war had by this time, following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, the war was being escalated by the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and we can talk more about Lyndon Johnson if you wish in the question period. But it became a very major agenda item for him, as probably many of you know, to escalate this war for various reasons, and one result was the draft became a ubiquitous thing. And Michael saw around him his friends being drafted, and he was very nervous about what all of that meant. He wasn't doing very well in school, and for the record, he was like 19 years old and not the wisest young man in the world. So he decided to enlist. And the reason for that was he thought if he did that, he could go to officer candidate school, learn to be a helicopter pilot, and by that time the war would be over because wars take 4 years. That's how that worked for people who grew up in the post-World War II era. That's what he said to his friends. That was his thinking. And then he thought, I'll have a skill. I'll be a helicopter pilot. Who knows? That might be a useful thing. Of course, it didn't work out like that for him. But 2 weeks after he enlisted, his best friend Marcus was drafted. Marcus made a different decision. He would go to the war for 1 year, which was the obligation. He became a combat engineer. So he was off to Vietnam, had his military service, and back before Michael was out of the training process that ultimately would send him to war 3 or 4 years after that. So as a young man and a songwriter, he then found himself into the military, and he went through training in various bases around the United States to learn how to be a helicopter pilot. He wrote quite a lot about what that was like, and I write about that a little bit in the book because this was in so many ways an unusual and unprecedented war, and one of them was the use of these helicopters, which helped to define the military strategy and practice of everyone in Vietnam on the American side. We'll come a little bit in a moment to the military strategy about helicopters. Here's Marcus as a soldier, as a combat engineer. And Michael still had his sense of humor. As he was training to be a pilot, he still wrote music. He wasn't yet writing much poetry. Mostly he was writing songs, mostly about women and being happy in the future, the kind of things young men of infinite hope write about when they're 19, 20 years old. About 6 months before he was deployed in Vietnam, while he was still in military training, he reunited with a high school friend named Jane Hogue. They were classmates at Shorewood High School, and they fell in love and had a very intensive relationship for the last 6 months before he went. And in that time, they decided to get married, so they quietly got engaged with the idea that Michael would go to Vietnam and do his service, come back and pick up his musical career with Marcus and get married to Jane. And this is a picture of them just before he was deployed to Vietnam in 1969, when he was visiting with Jane and her parents in Florida. While he was training also to be a pilot, he lived by himself in a little apartment not too far from the base in Alabama. He got the idea to have a dog because he was an impractical young man. So he went out and he bought a basset hound. And he kept his dog while he was training to be a pilot. And he had a little sports car, and he would drive around Alabama with his dog and preparing to go to war. It was in some ways a kind of bittersweet time. This photograph of Invader, his dog, and Michael. At the same time all of this was happening, Lyndon Johnson was escalating the war in Vietnam. His primary ambition as president was to really, in some ways, to reinvent the New Deal, to have a domestic agenda focused on civil rights and in the empowerment of citizens. He was a very ambitious political leader who came out of the Senate. He was not deeply experienced in international affairs. He was an insecure president, at least that's my opinion. And I'm not the only one who has that opinion. And shortly after he took office, it became clear to him that the intractable Vietnam conflict, which was slowly growing from the time of Harry Truman through Eisenhower and Kennedy, each of whom had to deal with the problem of Vietnam and the escalation of communism throughout Southeast Asia. What does one do about that? Truman's containment strategy had been continued by these other presidents. Somehow hold it in check because this virus will continue to grow, and through what they call the domino effect, one country after another would fall into the hands of a communist government. Vietnam was a line in the sand, and each of the presidents prior to Lyndon Johnson endeavored one way or another to control that. In any case, Lyndon Johnson made the decision following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is another topic we can discuss, a rather specious claim of an attack on American soldiers that allowed him to go to the Senate through Senator Fulbright, who's in this picture, to give him the authorization to engage in military conflict and war without the authorization of Congress. And he used that Gulf of Tonkin resolution for the rest of his presidency to wage war without being candid or transparent to the Congress or to the American people. For much of his time in this role, he worked very closely with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and who has his own stories to tell about Vietnam, and some of these are included in the book. He placed responsibility for overseeing his strategy in Vietnam with William Westmoreland, who was in many ways the quintessential American general. He was one of the top graduates of West Point, rising to the level of major general in Vietnam, major general in the American Army, at a younger age than any other American soldier ever had. He was chosen to lead in Vietnam because he had all of those qualities. He had no experience in waging a counterinsurgency war, and the American government and the military did not have a good handle on what actually would be the most effective strategy. But the strategy he deployed was search and destroy, war of attrition. Wear down the enemy, grind their morale down, defeat them in exponential numbers of casualties, and eventually they will decide not to fight anymore. That was the strategy. Helicopters were crucial to that strategy because they were the means by which military assets could be deployed wherever they needed to be throughout Vietnam. So instead of having a war of territory to win land, which is what wars were usually like prior to that time, they would go wage a battle, inflict casualties, and leave. And they did not really understand in a deep way the nature of why the enemy was fighting and what they were actually hoping to accomplish, and they had no success really in wearing down the morale or resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. So the helicopter war was ultimately not very successful. We'll come back to that in a moment, but that's what Michael O'Donnell's assignment was as a helicopter pilot, to advance that fundamental strategy of the war. This is the kitchen cabinet of the president, who were engaged in discussions about what to do in Vietnam, and I include this photograph only because third from the left is Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, whom I had the good fortune to interview at length about this period in his life and about Vietnam before he passed away some years ago. And it was a very interesting window into, from someone sitting at the table, what was going on and how they were thinking about the war. So Michael was deployed to Vietnam in October of 1969. He brought his dog Invader home to be with his family, and he was gone. And this is just a picture of the dog with the family dog. Michael arrived in Vietnam and was assigned to the 170th Helicopter Assault Unit, and he was piloting a helicopter called a Slick. It was a Huey, but not a gunship. Its job was to transport soldiers and to recover the wounded and the dead, to just move people around to be able to implement this strategy of attrition that I've talked about. And this is Michael on the right with, I don't know who the other person in the picture is, but these are the kind of helicopters that he was piloting. He was assigned to Fort Holloway, Camp Holloway, when he first arrived, a very large base of about 10,000 soldiers and many other camp followers for the first few months. And then he was moved to Kon Tum, a very, very small base further to the north in the central highlands of Vietnam, where he was surrounded by the enemy in a very isolated place. There were mostly just a few helicopter pilots and units there, and their job was to fly these missions. I interviewed one of his fellow soldiers, Jim Lake, whom I'll come back to in a moment, who described that their lives in Kon Tum were in many ways very surreal. They were flying these missions every single day, pretty much. But they were in this safe place, so they'd get up in the morning and have a hot shower and breakfast and put on their uniform. And then they would leave the base and go into the war, where they saw among the highest casualty rates of anyone in the war. Being a helicopter pilot was a very dangerous enterprise. And then they'd come back to their base and do the same thing. During that time, Michael began writing poetry. The rest of his friends there they would shower and go to the bar and have dinner and then spend the night at the bar. But he brought a little typewriter with him, and he was writing poetry. So he's flying into the war every day, experiencing these casualties, as he writes in one of his poems, hosing out the blood out of his helicopter every day, and reenacting that same drama every single day. And he was writing poetry about it. And as he was writing this, we also see in the arc of his poetry that this happy-go-lucky guy that you saw before eventually becomes to see he's not going to live through this war. It was clear to him. The odds just aren't likely going to end well for him. So he was at this base, and Jim Lake reports that during this time they were flying these missions. Every night when they returned, they would go up into this control tower, and every night, the Viet Cong would attack the base. Every single night. They would send missiles into the base. And for whatever reason, Jim said, these missiles were enormous. They were the size of telephone poles. They were terrifying, and they never hit anything. So they weren't nervous about what it actually meant to be under attack, but they were reminders of the context in which they were fighting. And these pictures were taken during that time. The helicopter war, as I mentioned, was extraordinarily dangerous. This helicopter had more than 100 bullet holes in it after a single mission. These things happened all the time. And pilots and crews were dying on a regular basis. So it was inevitable, as I said, for Michael to come to terms with what it meant to be flying in this way. As I said, early in the winter, he moved to Kontum, and then he was flying missions out of a small village called Dak To, which was further to the north. And this was in February and March of 1970, before Richard Nixon had declared that we would extend the war into Cambodia, which he did in April. But in March, Michael was flying missions into Cambodia, secret missions, to deliver commandos doing reconnaissance work in enemy territory. So during this time, each day he would fly the undercover into enemy territory and deliver these commandos. And as I say, he was writing poems at this time. This picture was taken of him at that time while he was flying those missions. On March 24th, 1970, he flew the mission that ultimately resulted in his status of being missing in action. I'll just tell you a little bit about what actually happened there. One of the reconnaissance units had been inserted into Cambodia a few days ahead of time of that, and they were under attack by the enemy immediately. And they declared an emergency that they needed to be rescued right away, or they would be overrun by the enemy. So in this case, the helicopter units scramble and put together an emergency rescue. It's a very complicated, choreographed process that involves more than 10 aircraft to do this effectively. There are several fixed-wing aircraft that are hovering over the action, and then the helicopters come and do various kinds of things, which I'll describe. So Michael and his colleagues were all sent off to make a rescue on March 24th of this reconnaissance team that was in duress. And as they arrived on the scene where the action was, the reconnaissance team was not able to get to the rescue zone quickly enough, and they were running actually headlong, being chased by the enemy. We have testimony of all of this. So in the book, I had the opportunity to tell the story in an almost by minute basis because of the available evidence that we have. So the reconnaissance team was running through the jungle trying to get to the landing zone, and Michael and the other helicopters were hovering. And Jim Lake, who was the mission commander at a certain point, realized they did not have enough fuel in order to effect the rescue, given how much time it was going to take for the commandos to get there. So he said to O'Donnell, stay here as long as you can, monitor the situation, and I'm going to take everyone else, and we're going to go back to Dak To to get our fuel and come back. It takes about 15 minutes each way. It'll take 5-10 minutes to get fuel. I'll be back in 40 minutes. Don't do anything until I get back. Just monitor the situation. So off they went, and Michael was hovering at about 1,000 feet above the action. And at a certain point during that interval, the commandos were out of time. They were about to be overrun, and they radioed up, if we're not rescued right now, we will die. So Michael made the instant decision, that he would go down and rescue them on his own with his crew of 3 other soldiers on helicopter. In the meantime, this is all almost cinematic. The other helicopters were coming back on the scene. They were 5 minutes away, and they were in radio contact with O'Donnell and with the soldiers on the ground. And Lake said, don't go down. I will do it when I get here. It's my responsibility to do that. And O'Donnell said, there is no time. They will die. So I'm going, and he went. And he slowly lowered the helicopter down through the jungle canopy. Imagine this is a dense jungle. There is no landing zone here. There is nowhere to effect a safe rescue. So they had to lower the helicopter under the tree canopy and find his way to the ground, which he did in a valley in this part of Cambodia. And the commandos arrived 4 minutes later. So O'Donnell and his crew sat there in a live battle zone for 4 minutes waiting for the opportunity to take these guys away. But they arrived and they got on the helicopter and he effected the rescue. And as he cleared the tree line, by this time Lake and the others are on the scene, he said, "I've got them all, I'm coming out," and he started to move forward. And as he did through the valley, the helicopter was hit by a missile. And it caught fire and it fell through the sky back into the jungle and then burst in flames. And Lake and the others all watched all of this happen. So immediately, Jim Lake tried to lower the helicopter, to fly by and see if he could discover if anyone had survived or the nature of the crash site. But he was unable to make any kind of progress. The hillsides were filled with the enemy. So he returned to altitude in the 8 helicopters, and he gave the command to return to base, knowing full well that no one would ever come back to look for them, that this was the end, because they were in enemy territory and there was no basis for conducting additional rescue attempts. So Lake gave that command, and the helicopters returned back to the base. He was 19 years old when he made that decision. I interviewed him just a few years ago as I was writing this book, and I have an image of Jim Lake here, but we'll come to that in a little bit. Jim spent his whole career in the military. He got out of Vietnam, but he stayed in the military his whole career. He was this tough guy, a military guy. And when I interviewed him, he has never recovered from that decision. He was in tears describing what it was like to have to make that decision, knowing that he was the one who should have died that day, not Michael O'Donnell. And it was really a powerful and remarkable experience to see 5 decades later how powerful that experience was for him still. So in this image, you can see where the mission actually took place. You see the red line going up to the right-hand, top right corner of Cambodia. It's called the Dragon's Tail region. That's what the soldiers called it. And it was just over the line from Vietnam. That's where the mission was. That's ultimately where the helicopter crashed. So Michael O'Donnell was declared missing and in action, and part of my research in the book was to chronicle what it means to be missing in action. The U.S. military has a strategy, a policy, that they will stay close to the families of those who are missing in action, so they know that the Army and the government continues to hold their situation close at hand. As a result, every month or 2 or 3 for 30 years, the O'Donnell family received a letter from the Army. I had those in this pile of materials that Patsy gave me. An unidentified Caucasian male was seen on the streets of Hanoi resembling your son. An investigation is underway. We will inform you as soon as we have more information. 2 months later, it was a false alarm. There's a stack of letters of one form or another. There's no further progress on the status of your son. There's no further like that. In 1978, 8 years after the helicopter crashed, the family was convinced that Michael was not coming back and that he had not survived. So they petitioned the president to have him declared legally dead so they could at least have closure, because in their own minds, Michael was dead. And so Jimmy Carter did that, and he was declared legally deceased at that time. But they still continued to receive communications from the Army until the status of MIA was converted to something else. Following the end of the war, as some of you may remember during that time, people wanted to run far away from talking about Vietnam in 1975 by the time the South Vietnamese were overrun by the North Vietnamese and the war was over. And so for the next several years, there was not much said about the war. There wasn't much done about the war. But by the late 70s and early 80s, there was a new initiative to begin that was actually begun by families of the missing in action and prisoners of war who felt that we need to find these people. And so a new unit of the military was created called the Joint Task Force Full Accounting, and their mission was to recover the remains of American servicemen and women all over the world when they're identified. And in that period of time, that's when we begin to see evidence not only of recoveries being made in Vietnam, but also in the South Pacific from World War II. Even today, every few months, we'll read a story about a helicopter recovery or a plane crash or something from one of those wars. They began looking in earnest in the mid-1990s for Michael O'Donnell's helicopter because they had a reasonably good idea about where it fell based on the map that I just showed you. And they were unsuccessful. One attempt after another, and they were unsuccessful. But by the late 1990s, they did recover the remains. And as you can see here, and there's a whole chapter in the book about this recovery, which is itself quite a story, you can see how difficult it would be to find these remains. This helicopter at 50 feet would not hardly be noticeable in the jungle. So imagine how difficult it is to find. It couldn't be found from the air because it's covered by the jungle canopy, and even on the ground. So they had to work with foragers and villagers who worked in these areas and knew where these crash sites were, and that's how they found it, through a Cambodian forager who knew where this was. Once the site is located, they followed a very careful forensic approach to try to identify what remains could be found. Tropical jungle, 30 years after a helicopter was shot down and destroyed by fire, how much Treeman remains are likely to be found anyway? The first thing the crew does is they identify on the crash site any kind of surviving material they can. So everywhere you see an orange flag, they found something. It might be a camera case or a boot or something. No human remains. Human remains find their way into the ground. None are above the ground. But other things they found. Once they recover all of those objects above the surface, they then completely clear the jungle, 150 yards in one direction and 50 yards on either side of the helicopter on another. And they create a series of grids to do an archaeological excavation, a forensic examination. It is meticulous, back-breaking, and dangerous work. You can imagine what it's like to work in those conditions. This spot is 50 kilometers away from the nearest small village. There's no access to any resources at all, so they had to set up an encampment there to do this work. It took about 30 days. So as they cleared it away, you can see from this image what the helicopter and the remains looked like. That was O'Donnell's helicopter, number 262. This is the kind of material that they found in the ground or around it. Life support equipment, dog tags, personal items of jewelry, that sort of thing. But really what they were there to do is to try to find the human remains so they could have closure and identify the dead for the families. They found, by excavating, they would dig into the ground, about a foot into the ground, and sift all of the soil in order to identify bone fragments and teeth, and then they would conduct DNA examinations. When the helicopter was found, they called Patsy and said, "We found the helicopter and we are recovering remains. So we're very optimistic, and we'll be able to tell you whether we've identified your brother in 2 or 3 years," because that's how long it takes to conduct this sort of scientific examination. But by this time, Patsy was used to waiting. But they did identify the remains of Michael O'Donnell, and where his human remains were found, they also found his dog tag, which is what you see in this image, and they sent that to his sister. So she had something from her brother. So at that time, in 1998, the remains were recovered, and he was buried at Arlington with full military honors 2 weeks before 9/11 in 2001. So part of what I explore in this book is the kind of arc of history from one ill-advised, ill-conceived war right into a series of other ones. So as I reflect on all of this, and I'll finish my remarks in the next 2 minutes and we can have questions. In writing this book, I was seeking to learn something. I wanted to tell Michael's story, but I also wanted to learn something. And I'd like to just point out a couple of lessons that I learned from this book that were at least helpful for me in coming to terms with this experience and this tragedy. The first was I learned a great deal about leadership and decision-making. And I have to say I'm not an American historian. I'm not a political scientist. Many of you in the room are. But I was just dumbstruck by the lack of serious and rigorous information preparation decision-making by our leaders. When they made decisions, when Lyndon Johnson made the decision to escalate this war, he put far less time and effort into that decision than he should have, in my view. And he surrounded himself by people who enabled bad decision-making. He didn't like dissent. He overwhelmed people. And he created an environment where it was unlikely he would be able to think through carefully the consequences of his decisions. So I wanted to understand that a little bit better, and I was not impressed by any of them. McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, this whole group of extraordinarily talented people. How could they have done such a poor job They didn't even deeply understand what the enemy was fighting for. They didn't understand the nature of the enemy. They did not understand what this counterinsurgency strategy would likely produce. And as they saw evidence of failure, they suppressed it, and they did not share it with the public. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, and he's on a recording saying this to McGeorge Bundy, "I don't want to escalate this war. I can't imagine anything good is going to come of it. Once we get into it, we won't get out, and I don't see how we can win." At the time he said that, 400 American soldiers had been killed. At the end, there were more than 58,000 who died. So what happened between 1964 and 1975 that allowed us to continue to see this war escalate as it had? There were no clear principles about when a president has the authority to commit other people's lives in service of a political idea. What are the criteria for making that decision? When do you commit American troops? It isn't clear to me they thought that through very carefully. Indeed, it's not clear to me they think that through carefully now. But people die, and they never come back, and families never recover, and a statistic becomes a story, and a story becomes a legacy. And Michael O'Donnell's friends and family 50 years later are still living with the consequences of that decision. So I wanted to understand that. He didn't listen to the voices of others. He didn't listen to dissenting opinions. As a leader, that's a profound failure, not to understand the consequences of various scenarios. They didn't do a risk assessment of what happens if this doesn't go well, and so forth. So from a leadership standpoint, I found that to be very, very troubling. I came out very close to where R.C. McMaster comes out in his book on Vietnam, which is a terrible indictment of Lyndon Johnson. He was a very eminent military leader himself, McMaster was, and he knows much more about military strategy, and he concluded Lyndon Johnson's failures were failures of leadership. So that's one thing I learned. Another was I was very interested in war poetry. Why is that phenomenon such a powerful thing? We see it in the First World War, we see it a little bit less in the Second World War, and we see it in very large numbers in the Vietnam War. And there's a new publication on Vietnam War poetry still coming out. This is still something we write about and think about. What is it that compels people, in extremis as they are, to try to write something creative and beautiful or powerful and moving about their experience? And there's something, I think, deeply humane about understanding what that is. This desire to create something beautiful, something meaningful, and this is what Michael O'Donnell did every night. He would sit at his desk at his little typewriter and try to figure out how to make sense of the experience around him. And there's something really quite remarkable about that. We see that especially in World War I poetry, of the British soldiers in particular, but Vietnam as well. And I was very struck by that creative impulse and how it ties into poetry in wartime. I asked myself, to what extent is reconciliation possible? How does one come to terms 50 years after Michael O'Donnell's story, and almost 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War? What does reconciliation mean? How do people become reconciled to this experience? I think the answer, as I saw it, depends on who we're talking about. Those people closest to casualties of war who died as Michael O'Donnell did never become reconciled to that. It is a tragedy they live with for the rest of their lives. It is a weight that they bear. It is a burden that undermines the quality of their own lives. And perhaps is still terrible to deal with that kind of loss under a war like the Second World War, but at least there's the sense that it was towards some larger public good. And in this case, as O'Donnell said in his own poetry and as others talked about, we knew perfectly well no one cared, and we were going to die, and it didn't matter to the cause or to anyone else except our friends and family. And they felt trapped there. So I think ultimately reconciliation is a very difficult thing. I spent a great deal of time in the project of writing this, talking to Jane Mathis, Michael's fiancée, Marcus Sullivan, and Patsy McNevin. This is the last time Michael was with Jane. This is a photograph of her that weekend before he went to Vietnam. When I met her, this is what she looks like, and you can see she didn't change a lot. Really quite something. A wonderful woman. She remarried and got on with her life and lives in Florida. She's now retired. And she describes with great poignancy what it was like during those months with Michael. This is Jim Lake, the commissioned commander at the time he was in Vietnam as a 19-year-old. This was him when he retired from the military just a few years ago. He neither has recovered from this. I had the opportunity to take Marcus Sullivan to visit Michael's grave at Arlington. He had never been there, about 8 years ago or something. And this is a picture I took at the time of Marcus visiting the grave. A very powerful experience for him to see the site where his friend now finally remained. Michael's poetry lived on in very powerful ways, including after 9/11. New York City produced a commemorative volume to remember that day, about a year after the attacks. And the last page of that book includes Michael O'Donnell's poem. It's been retitled, but it's the same poem. And it finds its way here and there. It resonates with people in very powerful ways, and I know that would have meant a great deal to Michael. Then ultimately, of course, following 9/11, we entered new wars, and that area where Michael was buried in 2001, which was completely bereft of gravestones. Only the large ones you see in the foreground were there when I first visited the grave in 2003. And now they're filled with the remains of soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq. So one greater question is, what actually have we learned, and where do we go from here? Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, or yeah, please. Yes, microphones up front.
I don't know. It seems like a very odd question, but I'm a poet, so what I want to know is, why would they change the title of his poem that he wrote?
Good question. I don't know. The rights to the poetry were controlled by Patsy, and I don't know what her exchange was with the people who made that book. So
Is there a book of his poetry that I can buy and read?
No, there is. His poetry is published in this book. About 12 of his poems are. He wrote about 50 poems in Vietnam, and there may subsequently be a publication, but there isn't one now.
Going to take advantage of being the host of this to also ask a question. So now listening to you present about what motivated you to write this book, I was quite struck with the juxtaposition between Michael O'Donnell's life and his experience in the war, and then the high-level decision-making. And I thought that you wove them together quite nicely, that we got the context of sort of what brought Michael to where he was at any point in his service in Vietnam. And I guess the one of the things that struck me while reading the book was that he never wrote about Vietnam to his friends. In terms of, I mean, he was ignoring the war until a certain moment when I think the despair struck him, and he couldn't help but write it. And I wondered, in terms of your writing in that time, was that that must have been a factor of why, it was sort of that you sort of pieced together what was happening up at the top with his life, because he purposely turned away from talking about that. And I wondered if anyone you interviewed, was this something, and again, because the book says, he didn't really share it with the soldiers, and they only found his book of poetry, Letters of Pleiku, after he had died. But I was just very interested that he never really wrote about even his military training, what he was going to do, and then once he arrived there, until it was too late, and then the despair basically took over, and that was all that he could write about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. He compartmentalized the Vietnam experience as best he could. When he was still training in the U.S., he didn't write about it at all. And even when Jane or others wanted to talk about it, he would quickly change the subject. He just didn't want to even talk about it. He did, on occasion, in his letters, talk about military training, about learning to fly a helicopter, but it was mostly sort of amusing conversation rather than deep. But exactly as you say, in Vietnam, he started writing poetry in a serious way when he got off the airplane in Vietnam. That was really the moment for him, when poetry became something, a creative outlet that he sought. And he wrote about his experiences in all kinds of ways, of what it meant to be a soldier walking around in these places and being in battle, and how his interior experience was. But he didn't share that with anyone except Marcus. He sent his poetry to Marcus. He shared everything with Marcus. But even his sister, he just said, I don't want to talk about it. It ain't great, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It's not great. But I don't want to talk about that. I hear you're going to London. Have a great time. I'm having a vacation in Vietnam. I hope you have more fun than I'm having. That kind of thing. That's what he was like. But he didn't otherwise. But his interior experience took over, just as you said. And at a certain point, I think that's when he began to confront the futility of it, and then it changed. Yes?
Good evening. My name is Noah Faison. I'm a student in Columbia College. My question is about your thoughts on how we should be presenting, reflecting on, and teaching this sort of culture. Because I think that's really what it is in some ways, a veterans culture. And I'm wondering, as you think back to writing this book, to interacting with Michael's personal effects, and your experience managing one of the premier centers of culture in the city, what thoughts do you have for how we as a country, or the field of art history, American history, can do a better job presenting the stories of people like Michael, and teaching some of the broader lessons?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. I think that there is an ongoing challenge in finding ways to engage people at a human level in understanding these kinds of consequences. It's most of the time we're just overwhelmed by the data associated with these losses. On the news, a helicopter crashed with a bunch of soldiers, and news at 6. And that's all we heard about it. But everyone affected by that, it's a very different story. So I think at one level, it's finding ways to connect people to human tragedies so that we are more alert to the consequences of these decisions, because they're profoundly meaningful for our society. Culture is a way, or let's call it art, it is a way of connecting people in an elevated kind of context for understanding and appreciation, and ultimately to be moved. That's what most of us seek out of art, not just to be entertained, but to have a profound experience that offers us a new way of thinking about the world or ourselves, to move us in some way. Poetry is in some ways the most immediate way of doing that, because that's what poems are attempting to do. But the fine arts do it, music does it, theater does it. And I think there is a great movement of culture associated with Vietnam, that it's trying to connect people to the human dimension of that tragedy. And so one thing we can do is keep that alive. Read these books, support these poets, buy that new poetry book, which is just coming out. Take an interest in these stories these people have to tell, because that connects us to our own humanity as well. And I think art and culture, far from being a marginal activity that enriches our days, it's at the center of who we are. And for people like Michael O'Donnell, that's all they had. Yes, sir.
Yeah, agreeing with you about the leadership question, how do you interpret, or what would your comment be on Johnson's so-called, on his resignation, refusal to run, and what the implications might have been for what happened later on?
Is the question, I'm sorry, I didn't follow, the question about his resignation?
Yeah.
And what I make of that?
Yeah.
Well, I think ultimately what ended the war in Vietnam over the long term was the public, noisy voice of a protesting public. And that is to say, ultimately, these leaders were overwhelmed, and they no longer could lead. And Lyndon Johnson had to confront the fact that by 1968, his support had been gone. He could not imagine a way forward. He recognized the failure of his policies in Vietnam, and ultimately the destruction of his legacy as a domestic-focused president. That said, in 1968, we were still 5 years away from the end of the war for us, and a lot more people died. So I think his failure was in some ways a progress in terms of ending that war, but Richard Nixon did not do that so quickly. And I think most people who knew Lyndon Johnson and who had some sympathy for him knew how terrible this was for him too. That doesn't excuse his leadership, but he ultimately died from it. Yeah, sure.
Hey, as someone who is daughter of the Vietnam War survivors, the first time I read about the Vietnam War in a novel was in college, and I think about the disconnect when it comes to war literature and the youth. And as someone who is doing education policy, one of the things we struggle in terms of the curriculum is having youth such as middle school and high school students being exposed to war literature, and there's a huge debate on that. So particularly to your book, but in terms of novels about war, what do you think is the appropriate grade level or age that your book would be placed into, and how can we make young people be more exposed to these narratives?
Well, I think that I'm not an educator at that level. I was once a university professor, which is a different thing. But I've heard from various people who are knowledgeable about this, and they've said in very nice ways that it'd be great if high school seniors would read your book. That's a level where maybe they'll learn something. One of the things I tried to do in this book was to write a book that isn't too long, that touches on these issues, because every other book I found on Vietnam was 400 pages on the helicopter war, or 300 pages on what it meant to be a grunt, or my memoirs. And that's not the audience I was seeking. I was trying to write a human interest story around the 1960s in Vietnam in a way where people would understand the basic sequence of events. So a book like that, mine or others, for students in high school who are alert to what's going on around the world, I think is useful. Younger than that, I'm not so sure. So thank you.
Hi. In light of your discussion at the beginning about the draft and how it wasn't affecting you, I wonder if you thought through whether it was, in fact, a good idea to get rid of the draft, particularly when you're thinking about how public policy, public opinion went against the war.
I think with no draft, then there is not a widespread community requirement for support of a war. And I am not in favor of waging war without a draft. I think there ought to be an obligation that either people serve or we don't go to war. Put differently, if we had said to those guys sitting around the table in the White House, go ahead and war, but every one of your children is going to Vietnam, every one of them, and then you tell me if you're going to make the same decision. So I think the immediacy and the urgency of a public commitment to such a catastrophic thing as a war, even if we win it, requires a greater level of public involvement. Because without a draft, who ends up going and who doesn't go?
Right. I agree with you, and I was in the Peace Corps when he was there, doing what he was doing, and I think you're right. If you don't have any skin in the game, you really don't pay much attention.
And this is what we've seen in the last several decades. Yes.
I'm just
Sorry.
curious, based on your experience in the investigative journey that you took to collect this material, if you have discovered other topics that you want to write about. Like you mentioned leadership in this war, you mentioned about literary expression in wars. Are there topics waiting for further coverage that maybe personally you're interested in?
Yeah, thank you for your question. For reasons I don't really know, we could have a therapy session. I don't really know why this sort of thing moves me as it does. But some years ago, I encountered a photograph of a young woman being publicly executed by the Nazis. And she was the first civilian publicly executed in the Soviet Union during the war. And at the time I saw the photograph, her identity was not known. So I did that project too, and I found out who she was and published a series of articles about her because it felt to me like history deserved, we ought to know who she was. And it turned out it wasn't all that hard to find out who she was. And the reason her identity had been suppressed because the government, the Soviet Union, didn't want people to know who she was because she was a Jew. And they were not going to have a national heroine be a Jew at that time. After those articles were published, they relented, and her identity has now been commemorated. So I think somehow there's something very poignant for me about the human consequences of these kinds of commitments that we make as societies. And the least we can do, each of us in our own way, is try to remember. Because in remembering at least one person for whatever reason, we do a certain kind of honor. So my next project like this is I've come across a character from the Revolutionary War that I'd like to write about, which requires, I don't know, not now, but someday. There are lots of these stories out there.
Thank you so very much. Back in November, I had a chance to ask Robert Kennedy's daughter why we underfund education in this country. her answer was, because America feels strong when we have a strong military. But that's not the case. We're strong when we invite immigrants into this country and give them opportunities.
Right.
I also think we underfund education because that keeps people like O'Donnell going to the military for their education and training. Do you agree?
Well, I think, yes, I think we underfund education for a whole constellation of reasons, and we could talk about them in some detail. But I do believe that for our democracy to function, let alone flourish, it requires, as Thomas Jefferson said, an educated citizenry. And that is why, following the creation of this country, there were hundreds of colleges and universities created all over the landscape of the United States with the idea that people are going to vote and they're going to function in a democracy. They need to know what they're doing. They need to understand the world around them. And I think we are all seeing the consequences of a citizenry that's not engaged. Whether they're educated or not, they're not educated to the issues they need to be. We don't know how to evaluate leaders. We don't know how to choose them. We don't know how to hold them accountable. So your question is about education, but my answer has to do with what education, that it's a fundamental need for a functioning democracy. And if we back away from that commitment, and you see it at the state level all over the country that we have, we will live with those consequences over the long term because the electorate won't be competent.
We're living with them now, aren't we?
We are. I think we are.
Thank you. Very powerful stuff. That whole period of time was filled with poetry. The poetry of the Beatles, the poetry of the Rolling Stones, the impact of Allen Ginsberg. People just were beginning to read Wilfred Owen because he'd been relatively unknown.
Yes.
And I attended the first events where veterans came back and read their poetry, and nobody gave a shit. Okay? Total indifference. Nobody came, nobody cared, nobody gave a shit. Okay? In New York City, I went to several events like that. Nobody attended because people were not willing to confront what was going on. So 50 to 60 years later, we memorialize a powerful set of poems by a gentleman who was shot down and killed in a MACV SOG operation, it sounds like to me.
Right, exactly.
Now, I want to ask you about the power of art, because that period was filled with artistic expression that broke boundaries. As you know, museums were confronted in New York over their unwillingness to deal with the war, to act as artists or defined as those that provoke and challenge us to think. So how do we look on this period, this artistic period, filled with all this expression, and use it to educate and stimulate, and consider the fact that we're going through a period as Americans, in some ways very similar to that period right now?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question, and you describe well what was happening on the ground at that time. And soldiers who fought in Vietnam were reviled. They were aligned with the people who made the decisions. That's what Michael O'Donnell was writing about. Whatever you think of the war, don't forget the soldiers who fought. I think one positive thing that came from Vietnam, I think most of us would have said in 1975 at least two positive things will come from this war. One, we'll never do that again, which is not true. And two, we won't blame the soldiers for doing the work that they were called upon to do. At least that issue, I think, has changed. People understand and appreciate that soldiers today, I don't think the Veterans Authority invests as it should. I'm not saying that. But the general public does not. They value soldiers. They appreciate their service. At least that's different than it was in the 1960s and 70s. And I think you're exactly right that in the midst, and this is one of the reasons I was interested in this book, in the midst of this very dramatic, powerful time, the 1960s was an extraordinarily powerful, creative time. It was mostly the voice of youth. But I write about this in the book, that in music and art, and it was a very lively time. But the people who were controlling institutions, like my job, they weren't interested in those noisy people who are going to make trouble. We have plans, and we don't need that. And it took a while for them to understand the world was changing around them. I think we're living in that now. This campus and every campus is being disrupted in all kinds of ways, about rules about who's on our board and whose money should we take and what kind of institution should we be leading. These are the kind of questions that ultimately lead to change, and they're very healthy, but one has to know how to navigate them. In the 1960s, they didn't. But maybe we can do better now.
Hello. I wanted to say that if we had the draft today, I don't think it would matter at all, because during the 60s and 70s, I had cousins that were drafted. And you know what they did? They drafted black, brown, and poor people. If you were in college or you had money, you didn't go into the draft, okay? You might have had a few people that had some money and they felt maybe an obligation that they should go anyway, but the majority of people that were in colleges, that had money, did not go. Okay, so the same thing would happen today. Senators, politicians, their children would not go in, because if you have money, or you think someone like Donald Trump's sons would actually go into be drafted? No. It's going to be poor people and brown and black people that would be drafted. So I don't see any difference if whether you have to draft or not, because there's going to be certain people that are just not going to be drafted.
Well, you're right, and that injustice, a draft is supposed to share equitably the burden of service. And you're right, it didn't happen that way. There was a great epidemic of bone spurs in the 1960s. So I hear you. Yes, sir.
Hey, thanks for the talk.
Maybe one more question? Yeah, please.
My name is Chris Nguyen. My grandfather was a colonel in the South Vietnamese Army. He was also based in the Central Highlands.
Wow.
And particularly in Dalat, which, FYI, I think it was misspelled on that map.
The American Army made that map. They don't make mistakes.
Every Vietnamese word is monosyllabic. I think that was it was combined. But anyways, my question is, if our political leadership had conducted the war in a more intelligent and thoughtful way, would it have been worth it, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think the premise was flawed in the first place. So it's hard to know if the war had been prosecuted in a different way, if the result would have been different. People have asked me in the context of talking about this book, what would have happened if John F. Kennedy wasn't assassinated? Would he have escalated the war? I very seriously doubt that he would have, because he was a very cautious politician in that way, as we know from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Who really knows? But Lyndon Johnson did what no other president had done, which was he made this a litmus test for his I don't know what, bravado. I believe the war would likely have been a very different war, but I think ultimately the fundamental premise should have been questioned as to what is containment and what really is the risk of communism and so forth. But I'm not a political scientist, so I can say that. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.